April 14th, 1865 AD, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. On April 14th, 1865, President of the United States Abraham Lincoln was shot in the back of the head by American stage actor John Wilkes Booth with a small caliber pistol. Booth plotted this Machiavellian scheme in which he and his cohorts would wipe out Lincoln's cabinet in a highly organized assassination plot in which the President, his Vice President, and the Secretary of State would be killed all at the same time. However, Booth is one of those guys who likes to surround himself with morons to make himself look like a genius. The two people he got to go in this scheme were Lewis Powell, aka Lewis Payne, aka Lewis Payne, a former Confederate soldier who was also known as Mr. Wood. His part in the assassination conspiracy was almost blown in March when he was arrested for beating an African American maid. She had him arrested and said he was a Confederate spy. He played dumb, which wasn't a stretch for him, and told the authorities that he didn't know much English and took an oath of allegiance to the United States of America. The other key member was George Azadot, a Prussian immigrant who came to America at the age of 8. He could barely speak English, even though he lived in the United States for over 20 years. Azadot was a drunken, failed business owner who was influenced by Booth's racist rhetoric and joined his band of merry conspirators. Booth's assassination club held their meetings at the Seward boarding house where they planned their scheme over many bottles of booze. Mary Surratt would play hostess to her son John's racist friends who were also part of the club. He was a former spy for the Confederacy whose services were no longer required. Other members were Samuel Arnold, a Confederate sympathizer, and David Harold, a pharmacist assistant. They were also part of Surratt's kitchen table. The group met for a final time that night at 8:45 p.m. on April 14th. Lewis was supposed to kill Secretary of State William Seward with Harold to guide him back to a mysterious hideout because he didn't know his way around Washington, D.C. George Azarot was supposed to whack Vice President Andrew Johnson. He even got a room in the same boarding house he liked to frequent during his drinking binges. Booth wanted the head honcho, Abraham Lincoln. It was going to be an easy hit because he was attending the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater, one of the places he performed in, and knew the people who worked the building. The Lincolns would be watching the play from the presidential box seats in the balcony. Originally, Ulysses S. Grant and his wife were going to attend with the Lincolns, but they pulled out due to the wives of Grant and Lincoln despising one another. Booth arrived at Ford's Theater around 10:10 after having several drinks at a nearby tavern. He waited a few minutes before entering the president's balcony box. He was greeted at Ford's Theater by one of his drinking buddies, Edmund Spangler, who may or may not have been on the plot. He was a strange dude who was considered to have a severe drinking problem, even by 1800 standards. He looked after Booth's horse, which would be used later as a getaway. At 10:15 p.m., he crept up behind the president because all of his bodyguards were out drinking, and nobody would suspect the famous actor John Wilkes Booth of harming the president. He pulled out his Derringer pistol and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Union Major Henry Rathbone, who was in the box along with his fiancée, saw Booth with a pistol in his hand when the smoke cleared. He tried to grab him, but Booth slashed him from his elbow to shoulder with a small dagger. Booth jumped out of the presidential box, but one of his spurs got caught on the flag banners that draped the balcony as he fell onto the ground. He waved the bloody dagger in the air and shouted, "Sic semper," and I have done it. He hobbled away on his broken leg, stabbed the orchestra leader on his way out the door, and hopped on his getaway horse that was supposed to be looked after by Edmund Spangler, but he pawned this task off on another guy, Peanut Burrows, just so he could go out and have himself another drink. At 10:15 p.m., while Booth shot Lincoln in the back of the head, Lewis Powell walked up to Seward's residence, posing as a delivery boy from the pharmacy. He managed to get inside and claimed he had to give Mr. Seward his medicine personally. Seward's son, Frederick, got suspicious of Lewis and forbade him from entering his father's room. William Seward was recovering from the horse carriage accident, was bedridden, and surrounded by braces and pulleys. Frederick refused to let Powell inside his father's room, so he bum-rushed him after smacking him with his giant revolver when the gun didn't fire. He pushed aside his daughter Fanny, who was tending to his dad, and began to stab him with his bowie knife. But his cast and braces saved him from receiving any lethal wounds. Powell tried to escape, but was tackled by Seward's other son, Augustus, who was stabbed for his troubles, along with Seward's bodyguard, Sergeant George Robinson, who was also stabbed by Powell. Powell ran out of the house, screaming, "I'm mad! I'm mad!" David Harold, who was standing outside, took off after hearing the chaotic mess that Powell left, ditched him, and fled on his horse to meet up with Booth. Powell wandered around the streets of Washington, D.C. for hours, covered in blood on his horse, with nowhere to go because he didn't know his way around the city, and the hideout instructions he were given were useless to him because he just couldn't go up to anybody and ask for directions. George Azeroth was supposed to kill Andrew Johnson at 10:15 p.m., but he couldn't summon up the courage to walk into his room, which was near his inside the Kirkwood house. George decided to get drunk at the hotel bar. A few hours later, he began to wander around the streets of Washington, D.C., tossing his knife he was supposed to use to kill Johnson into a gutter and passed out at a nearby flophouse. Lincoln was taken to a nearby residence, the Peterson House. Major Henry Rathbone escorted Mrs. Lincoln to the Peterson house and after arriving passed out from massive blood loss. Lincoln was stripped of his clothes and placed on a bed. His doctors couldn't find any noticeable wounds and realized he was getting cold, so they applied mustard plasters and hot water bottles around his body while they piled on the blankets. A team of doctors surrounded the president and tried everything they could within their powers to save his life.